In the scandal of 1958, Debbie Reynolds lost her husband, Elizabeth Taylor lost her reputation, and Eddie Fisher lost his dignity. So, who actually won? Only the puppet masters at MGM. They realized that a scandalous villain sells more tickets than a wholesome hero, and they happily sacrificed 3 lives to prove it. The explosion of 1958 was fueled by the pressure cooker of the MGM studio system, where Elizabeth and Debbie were raised. Signing contracts as teenagers and attending school together on the lot, they were less actresses and more children of the factory. Louis B. Mayer, the tyrannical head of the studio, viewed his stars quite literally as chattel, studio property. They told you how to wear your hair, who to date, and crucially who you were supposed to be to the public. By the late 1950s, the studio had successfully manufactured 2 opposing products. Elizabeth Taylor was the exotic orchid, branded as a creature of pure passion who felt things deeper than mere mortals, a woman who terrified and fascinated men in equal measure. Her deepest fear was loneliness. She craved a protector, a strong hand to guide her intensity. Then there was Debbie Reynolds, the fresh-faced daisy to Liz's orchid. She was the breakout star of St. in the Rain, bright, bubbly, and indefatigably optimistic. Exactly what post-war America wanted its young wives to be. Her driving motivation was stability. She wanted the picture-perfect family that the studio magazines promised. Despite these manufactured differences, their friendship was real. They bonded over the shared bizarre reality of growing up inside a dream factory. This wasn't a fake Hollywood acquaintance. Debbie was the matron of honor at Liz's wedding to Mike Todd in 1957. They were sisters in survival, navigating a system that treated them as interchangeable parts in a money-making machine. The dynamic of their friendship shifted when the men entered the picture, creating a quartet that seemed perfect on the surface but was rotting underneath. In 1955, Debbie married Eddie Fisher, the biggest pop idol in the country, a man whose wholesome voice dominated the charts. Eddie was best friends with the flamboyant, larger-than-life producer Mike Todd. When Elizabeth married Mike, her third marriage, it felt like the formation of a Hollywood royal court, but the power balance was dangerously skewed. Mike Todd was the undisputed king, the alpha male who commanded every room. Eddie Fisher was his shadow, his acolyte, a man who desperately wanted to be Mike Todd but lacked the grit. Debbie and Liz were pulled into this orbit, spending holidays and dinners together, unaware that the press and the studio were already sharpening their knives. The media loved the contrast, the sex symbol versus the sweetheart. They were already pitting them against each other in the public imagination, planting the seeds of rivalry long before the scandal broke. The studio saw them as assets to be compared and contrasted to maximize demographic reach. Liz appealed to the dark fantasies of men. Debbie appealed to the domestic dreams of women. The stage was perfectly set. All it needed was a spark to burn the whole structure down, and that spark would come from the most tragic event imaginable. On March 22, 1958, the fragile ecosystem of their lives was obliterated in an instant. The private plane, the Lucky Liz, named in honor of Elizabeth, crashed into the Zuni Mountains of New Mexico during a violent storm. Everyone on board was killed instantly, burned beyond recognition. The only reason Elizabeth wasn't on that plane was because Mike Todd had forbidden her to fly with a cold. When the news broke, the scream that tore from Elizabeth's throat was primal. She didn't just grieve, she unraveled. She threw herself down a staircase. She had to be physically restrained from hurting herself, and she was heavily sedated just to keep her heart from stopping. She was 26 years old, a widow for the second time, submerged in a depression so profound that those around her genuinely feared for her life. Into this vacuum of hysteria stepped Eddie Fisher. He rushed to her side immediately, leaving Debbie Reynolds at home to manage their 2 toddlers and the barrage of press calls. At first, it looked like the noble act of a best friend. Debbie explicitly encouraged him to go, believing it was his duty to save Mike's wife. But the Eddie Fisher who walked into Elizabeth's darkened mansion was not a sober man. The catastrophe that followed was written in his medical records. Eddie was a patient of Dr. Max Jacobson, the infamous Dr. Feelgood, who later treated President Kennedy. Jacobson's miracle tissue regenerator shots were a potent cocktail of amphetamines, animal placenta, and multivitamins. Eddie was shooting up this high-grade speed daily. The drug stripped away his inhibitions and inflated his ego to godlike proportions. In this chemical haze, he no longer viewed himself as a husband abandoning his wife, but as a savior, the only man alive strong enough to absorb the full force of Elizabeth Taylor's tragedy. He was manic, sleepless, and detached from reality. When he looked at Elizabeth, broken and weeping, he didn't see a friend. He saw an opportunity to finally step out of Mike Todd's shadow by possessing the one thing Mike prized above all else. For Elizabeth, the dynamic was even more twisted. Drugged on sedatives and blinded by grief, she wasn't falling in love with Eddie Fisher. She was using him as a conduit to the dead. Eddie sounded like Mike. He knew Mike's stories, and in the dim light of her grief, he was the closest living thing to her lost husband. This was psychological transference in its purest, most dangerous form. She clung to him not because of who he was, but because he was the wreckage she could hold on to. For weeks, they locked themselves away in a cocoon of shared misery and high-stakes drama, cutting off the outside world. Back at home, Debbie Reynolds waited for phone calls that never came, slowly realizing that the silence from her husband wasn't caused by grief, but by something far more sinister. By the time the fog began to lift, the line had been crossed. The comforting embraces had turned into a sexual and romantic obsession. The saint was still waiting by the phone, but the sinner had already claimed her husband. And when the door to that mansion finally opened, the story that walked out wasn't about a widow's survival. It was about a betrayal so shocking it would set the entire world on fire. When the story of the affair finally broke in September 1958, it didn't just leak, it exploded with the force of a nuclear detonation. The headlines were not merely reporting news, they were rendering a moral verdict. Eddie Fisher romances Liz Taylor. Debbie Reynolds alone with kids. The betrayal. In any other era, or with any other studio, this level of scandal would have been a career-ending catastrophe. The morality clauses in MGM contracts were ironclad. Stars had been fired for far less, for getting pregnant out of wedlock, for being gay, for political dissent. By all conventional logic, Elizabeth Taylor should have been suspended, her films buried, and her contract terminated to save the studio's reputation. But inside the executive offices of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the mood was not one of panic. It was one of cold, cynical calculation. The studio executives looked at the situation and realized they were staring at a financial miracle. They were weeks away from releasing Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, the adaptation of Tennessee Williams's sweltering play about a sexually frustrated, desperate woman named Maggie the Cat. In the film, Maggie is a woman starving for affection, fighting for her inheritance, and exuding a raw, dangerous sexuality. The studio publicists realized with a jolt of adrenaline that the real-life Elizabeth Taylor had just morphed into Maggie the Cat. The line between the character and the woman had vanished. If the public believed Elizabeth was a voracious, man-eating predator in real life, They wouldn't boycott the movie. They would line up around the block to see her. They would pay to see the monster in her natural habitat. And that is exactly what happened. The studio made a conscious decision not to kill the scandal, but to feed it. They effectively threw Elizabeth to the wolves because they knew the wolves paid for tickets. This decision marked a turning point in the history of celebrity culture. It was the moment Hollywood realized that infamy was just as profitable as fame. The studio did not issue denials. They did not try to soften Elizabeth's image. Instead, they let the Black Widow narrative run wild. They needed her to be the villain. Every hiss from the audience, every angry letter to the editor, every sermon preached against her from a church pulpit was free advertising for Cat on a hot tin roof. The film went on to become one of the highest-grossing movies of the year, saving MGM from a slump. Elizabeth Taylor's personal destruction was the studio's quarterly bonus. While the studio was content to let Elizabeth burn, they had a very different script prepared for Debbie Reynolds. If Elizabeth was to be the profitable villain, Debbie had to be the profitable victim. The saint versus sinner narrative required absolute contrast. There could be no shades of gray. Debbie was not allowed to be angry. She was not allowed to be a complex woman whose marriage had been failing long before the affair. She was not allowed to hate Eddie. She was drafted into the role of the ultimate martyr. The control MGM exerted over Debbie during these weeks was psychological torture disguised as public relations. The studio's PR department managed her every move. They choreographed her public appearances to maximize sympathy. There is a famous, gut-wrenching detail from this period that Debbie later revealed. Before she walked out to face the wall of paparazzi camped on her front lawn, photographers who were literally climbing her trees and peering into her windows, studio handlers would adjust her appearance to make her look more pathetic. They didn't want her looking like a movie star. They wanted her to look like a mother. Debbie recalled being told to pin a safety pin to her blouse or to carry a diaper, visual shorthands that screamed, "Abandoned housewife." They instructed her to look down, to keep her voice soft, to hold her children close. They needed the public to see a woman who was defenseless. When the press asked her about Elizabeth, Debbie was coached to express shock and sadness, never rage. "I'm still in love with my husband," she told the press, a line that twisted the knife in the public's heart. But behind closed doors, Debbie was living a nightmare. She was 26 years old, humiliated on a global scale, and stripped of her agency. She wasn't just losing her husband, she was losing her right to react to it. If she had screamed, if she had thrown Eddie's clothes onto the lawn, if she had called Elizabeth a slur in the press, the saint narrative would have collapsed. She would have been seen as a shrew, a bitter woman who drove her man away. The studio box required her to be passive. She had to swallow her pride, her anger, and her dignity to maintain the brand of America's sweetheart. She was the designated crier at her own funeral, performing grief for an audience of millions. The reaction from the American public was visceral and violent. It is hard for modern audiences to grasp the intensity of the hatred directed at Elizabeth Taylor in late 1958. This wasn't just internet trolling. This was physical. When Elizabeth ventured out in public, she was not asked for autographs. She was hissed at. Imagine walking into a restaurant in Beverly Hills, Chasen's or Romanoff's, and having the entire room fall silent, followed by the audible sound of women hissing like snakes. This happened to Elizabeth repeatedly. People spat at her car. The studio received sacks of mail filled with vitriol so vile that much of it had to be destroyed before it reached her desk. She was called a homewrecker, a tramp, and a threat to the American family. The press, led by the formidable gossip columnists Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, fanned these flames daily. Hedda Hopper, who had previously championed Elizabeth, turned on her with the fury of a betrayed mother. Hopper wrote scathing columns declaring that Elizabeth had destroyed the sanctity of marriage. These columnists were the gatekeepers of morality, and they declared open season on the sinner. They printed every rumor, every sighting, every whispered detail of her time with Eddie. They juxtaposed photos of Debbie holding her children with photos of Elizabeth wearing diamonds, creating a visual language of good versus evil that required no reading comprehension. The narrative was so pervasive that it infiltrated the set of Cat on a hot tin roof. Elizabeth was working with Paul Newman, and the tension on set was palpable. She was starving herself, her weight dropping to dangerous lows, her waist vanishing. The physical toll of the stress was making her look even more fragile and frantic, which ironically made her performance as Maggie the cat even more brilliant. The audience was watching a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown, both on screen and in real life. It was during this cauldron of hate that Elizabeth delivered the quote that would define her defiance. Confronted by a reporter about the scandal, about the impropriety of sleeping with her best friend's husband so soon after her own husband's death, Elizabeth snapped. She didn't apologize. She didn't cry. She looked the reporter in the eye and said, "Mike is dead and I'm alive. What do you expect me to do? Sleep alone?" It was a shocking, vulgar, and incredibly human thing to say. It was the roar of a wounded animal refusing to lie down and die. The public hated her for it, but they also couldn't look away. It was the moment Elizabeth Taylor decided that if the world was going to call her a whore, she would be the most glamorous, unrepentant, and fascinating whore they had ever seen. She refused the role of the victim. She chose the role of the antagonist. As 1958 bled into 1959, the psychological damage to both women began to calcify. They were trapped in a feedback loop. The more the press praised Debbie for her stoicism, the more she had to repress her true feelings. She became a prisoner of her own virtue. She couldn't date, she couldn't party, she couldn't make a mistake. She had to be the Virgin Mary of Hollywood. This repression created a deep internalized anxiety that would follow her for decades. The fear that if she ever dropped the mask, the love would disappear. For Elizabeth, the damage was the opposite. She was being rewarded for her bad behavior with attention and box office success, but she was being punished with isolation. She was winning the game but losing her soul. She began to believe that she was unworthy of genuine love. If the whole world sees you as a monster, you start to look in the mirror and see claws. This isolation drove her deeper into the arms of Eddie Fisher, not because she loved him, but because he was the only person on earth who was in the bunker with her. It was a relationship forged in a foxhole. They were two outcasts huddled together against a world that wanted to tear them apart. But a bunker is not a home, and a relationship built on mutual defense is not a marriage. The cruelest irony of this entire period was the erasure of the men. Mike Todd was the ghost haunting the proceedings, the man whose death started the dominoes falling. And Eddie Fisher? He had ceased to be a person. To the public, he was just a trophy, an object that had been stolen. To the studio, he was a plot device. And to Elizabeth, as the adrenaline of the scandal began to fade, he was starting to look less like a savior and more like a mistake. The stage was set for the next act. The scandal had peaked. The roles were established. Now the characters had to live with the consequences. Debbie had to face a divorce court, and Elizabeth had to face an altar. They were about to make the legal moves that would bind them to this narrative forever, unaware that the ground beneath their feet was already shifting again. The mechanism of their destruction was running at full speed, and it was about to demand a final ceremonial sacrifice. By the beginning of 1959, the sheer adrenaline of the scandal had worn off, replaced by a cold, suffocating reality. Both Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds found themselves standing at the edge of a cliff. The public viewed this as a soapy drama, a game of winners and losers. But for the women involved, it had become a grim game of survival. They were trapped in the roles they had been assigned, and the walls were closing in. For Debbie Reynolds, the situation was terrifyingly practical. In the 1950s, a divorce was not a simple administrative procedure. It was a social scar. She was 26, a single mother of 2 toddlers, facing a future where her primary identity, Eddie Fisher's wife, had been stolen. The studio was pressuring her to end the marriage legally to clean up the mess, but Debbie hesitated, not because she thought Eddie would come back, she knew he was gone, but because finalizing the divorce meant admitting that the dream was truly dead. She was facing a brutal financial reality. Eddie had been the primary earner, blowing money on gambling and his entourage. Debbie was left with the house, the kids, and the bills. She had to keep working, keep smiling, and keep filming to support her family, all while the press dissected her every facial expression for signs of a breakdown. She had 3 options: fight for a man who didn't want her, collapse under the pressure, or cut the limb to save the body. She chose the latter, but it was a decision made in agony, not anger. For Elizabeth, the trap was different, but equally lethal. She had burned down her reputation for Eddie Fisher. She had accepted the label of home wrecker. If she were to leave Eddie now, if she were to admit that the relationship was built on grief and amphetamines rather than true love, she would have destroyed Debbie's life for nothing. She would be not just a villain, but a fool. This is the psychological mechanism that kept Elizabeth bound to Eddie long after the passion faded. She had to prove to the world and to herself that this love was worth the destruction it caused. She was forced to double down on a bad bet. She had to perform a great romance for the cameras, clinging to Eddie's arm at nightclubs, laughing too loudly, smiling too widely. She was acting the role of the woman in love with the same intensity she brought to the screen because the alternative, admitting she was wrong, was too humiliating to bear. The violence of this period wasn't just emotional. It was an invasion of privacy that borders on the criminal by modern standards. The paparazzi culture that we associate with the 2000s, and Princess Diana actually has its roots here, in 1959, on the lawns of Beverly Hills. Debbie Reynolds lived under a state of siege. Photographers didn't just wait outside, they bribed delivery boys, they climbed fences, they followed her children to school. Every time she left her house, she was blinded by flashbulbs. The question was always the same, shouted by 100 rough voices. Do you hate her? Do you hate Liz? They wanted a soundbite of rage. They wanted the saint to crack. But Debbie, trained in the iron discipline of MGM, never gave it to them. She learned to walk through the mob with her head high, smiling a brittle, frozen smile. But the cost of that suppression was immense. Inside the house, away from the cameras, the stress was eating her alive. She was suffering from insomnia, panic attacks, and the profound loneliness of being the world's most famous victim. On the other side of town, Elizabeth was physically disintegrating. Her body had always been a barometer for her emotional state. During this period, she was plagued by mysterious fevers, respiratory infections, and back pain. She was hospitalized repeatedly. The public, whipped into a frenzy by the press, often dismissed her illnesses as pleas for sympathy or drama. "She's faking it," the columnists would whisper. But she wasn't faking. She was somatizing the guilt and the stress. She was carrying the hatred of millions of people in her lungs. The femme fatale, who looked so invincible in magazines, was, in reality, a frail young woman constantly hooked up to IVs, popping painkillers to get through the day and waking up screaming from nightmares about plane crashes. The sinner was paying for her sins in physical agony. The tragedy of the feud lies in what didn't happen. For almost a year, Elizabeth and Debbie, best friends who used to talk on the phone for hours every day, did not speak a single word to each other. They communicated entirely through lawyers, headlines, and the distorted rumors of mutual friends. This silence created an echo chamber where misunderstandings could grow into monsters. The press told Debbie that Liz was laughing at her, calling her a frigid little housewife. The press told Liz that Debbie was playing the victim to ruin Liz's career. Without direct contact to verify these claims, they began to believe the lies. There is a pivotal, heartbreaking moment that historians often point to, a specific phone call that sealed the door shut. Legend has it that in a moment of desperation or perhaps closure, Debbie tried to call the hotel room where Eddie and Liz were staying in New York. She wanted to speak to her husband, perhaps to discuss the children or the divorce terms. But Eddie didn't answer. Elizabeth did. According to the lore of the feud, the conversation was brief, icy, and devastating. Elizabeth, defensive and cornered, reportedly told Debbie, "If you couldn't keep him, you never should have had him." Or perhaps she said nothing at all, just a cold silence before hanging up. Whether the specific words are accurate is almost irrelevant. The impact was real. That moment represented the total failure of their friendship. It was the moment the sisterhood officially died. Debbie realized that the woman she loved like a sister was gone, replaced by a stranger who viewed her with contempt. Elizabeth, in her defensive crouch, viewed Debbie as the enemy who was denying her happiness. This was the mechanism of the feud: separation. If MGM had locked them in a room together for 1 hour in 1958, they might have cried, screamed, and eventually hugged. They would have realized they were both grieving Mike Todd. They would have realized Eddie was manipulating them both. But they were never given that hour. The system kept them apart, feeding them poison about the other, until the friendship was buried under a mountain of resentment. And so, with the bridges burned and the silence absolute, there was only one move left to play: the legal dismantling of one marriage and the construction of another. It was time for the crisis to reach its legal conclusion. But as Elizabeth Taylor prepared to walk down the aisle for the 4th time, she was about to discover that winning the man was actually the greatest punishment of all. On May 12, 1959, the curtain finally rose on the act everyone had been waiting for, in a spectacle that felt less like a holy union and more like a defiant press conference. Elizabeth Taylor and Eddie Fisher were married at Temple Beth Shalom in Las Vegas. The timing was aggressive, almost cruel. Debbie Reynolds had agreed to the divorce just hours earlier. The ink on the legal documents dissolving the sweetheart marriage was barely dry before Eddie was sliding a bracelet of 50 diamonds onto Elizabeth's wrist. To the outside world, this looked like the ultimate victory for the sinner. Elizabeth Taylor, the woman who had been hissed at in the streets, had successfully claimed her prize. She stood there in a moss-green silk dress, clutching a bouquet of orchids, flashing a smile that was meant to telegraph triumphant happiness to the world. The press devoured it. They framed it as the conquest of passion over propriety. But if you analyze the footage from that day and the days that immediately followed, you don't see the glow of a new bride. You see the manic, brittle energy of a woman who has backed herself into a corner. Elizabeth wasn't marrying Eddie Fisher because she saw a future with him. She was marrying him to retroactively justify the past year of chaos. She was marrying him to prove the haters wrong. It was a wedding fueled by spite and adrenaline, a public declaration that the destruction of Debbie's family had been worth it because it was for true love. This marriage was a fortress built to keep the critics out, but it was built on a foundation of sand. The moment the ceremony ended, the adrenaline crash began. The U.S. against the world narrative works perfectly when you are fighting a war. It falls apart completely when the war is over, and you are just two people sitting in a hotel room, realizing you have nothing in common but a dead man and a scandal. The detail that turns this from a soap opera into a tragedy is how quickly the illusion shattered. It didn't take years for the marriage to fail. It took weeks. Almost immediately into their honeymoon, Elizabeth Taylor woke up. The fog of grief and amphetamines that had clouded her judgment since Mike Todd's death began to lift. With clarity came horror. She looked across the breakfast table at Eddie Fisher and realized she was married to a stranger. Without the drama of the illicit affair, Eddie Fisher was revealed to be exactly who he always was, a talented but fundamentally weak man, deeply insecure and heavily dependent on drugs to function. He wasn't the strong protector she had projected onto him. He was a beta male who needed constant reassurance. He wasn't Mike Todd. He wasn't even a poor man's Mike Todd. He was just Eddie, needy, clingy, and boring. Elizabeth later confessed the chilling truth of this period. She realized she had married the ghost of Mike Todd. She had fallen in love with Eddie's grief, with his proximity to Mike, with the fact that they could cry together. But you cannot build a marriage on a graveyard. Once the tears dried, there was no intellectual connection, no sexual spark, no equal footing. The dynamic in the marriage shifted instantly from romance to contempt. Elizabeth, who respected strength above all else, began to despise Eddie for his subservience. He became her lapdog, fetching her drinks, holding her furs, desperate to please a wife who was clearly already looking for the exit. The prize she had fought the world for turned out to be a burden. She had destroyed her reputation and her best friend's life to win a man she didn't even want. While the marriage was disintegrating behind closed doors, the studio was counting its money. This is the third layer of the twist. The only true winner in the Saint versus Sinner war was MGM. The public's hatred of Elizabeth Taylor translated directly into box office gold. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof was a smash. Suddenly, Last Summer, released in late 1959, was another hit. The studio had successfully monetized the femme fatale archetype. They had proved that a bad woman could sell more tickets than a good one. They had no incentive to fix Elizabeth's image. They had every incentive to keep her controversial. For Debbie, the loss of Eddie was actually her salvation, though she couldn't see it yet. She was free of a drug-addicted, philandering husband. She retained her dignity, her children, and the adoration of the public. The divorce forced her to become independent, to sharpen her business acumen, and to build a career that would outlast Eddie's by 40 years. The narrative painted her as the loser, but in reality, she had escaped a sinking ship just before it went under. Elizabeth, conversely, was trapped on the wreck. She couldn't leave Eddie yet. It would be too humiliating to admit the mistake so soon. She was forced to live the lie she had created. She had to smile for the cameras, play the devoted wife, and endure the continued vilification of the public, all while being bored to death in her own home. She was a prisoner of her own pride. By the end of 1959, the situation had stabilized into a grim stalemate. The scandal had cooled, but the roles were set in concrete. Elizabeth was the homewrecker. Debbie was the victim. Eddie was the husband. But nature abhors a vacuum. Elizabeth Taylor was a woman of immense energy and appetite. She could not survive in a loveless, unequal marriage for long. She was essentially a dormant volcano, waiting for a tectonic shift. She needed a man who was her equal, someone who could match her drinking, her fighting, her intellect, and her stardom. She needed a monster to match her monster. And fate, with its sense of dramatic timing, was already preparing the stage. Across the ocean in Rome, a production was being assembled that would be the most expensive movie ever made. It was called Cleopatra. It was a project that would bankrupt a studio, nearly kill Elizabeth, and introduce her to the man who would make Eddie Fisher look like a footnote. The Saint versus Sinner chapter was closing, not with a bang, but with the hollow thud of a bad decision. The players were exhausted, but the real storm, the one that would rewrite the history of celebrity forever, was just gathering on the horizon. The tragedy of 1958 was just the prologue. The opera was about to begin. The resolution of the Eddie Fisher saga did not come through therapy or a quiet legal separation. It came in the form of a nuclear detonation on the set of Cleopatra in Rome, 1962. If the 1958 scandal was a tragedy, the 1962 scandal was an epic. Elizabeth Taylor had spent 3 years suffocating in her marriage to Eddie Fisher. She was bored, restless, and disgusted by his subservience. Then, Richard Burton walked onto the soundstage. Burton was a Welsh stage actor, a heavy drinker, a literary intellectual, and a man of ferocious, untamed masculinity. In short, he was everything Eddie Fisher was not. He was the monster Elizabeth had been waiting for. The contrast was humiliatingly stark. Eddie Fisher was on set in Rome, holding Elizabeth's purse, checking her schedule, effectively acting as her assistant. Richard Burton was on set challenging her, mocking her, and igniting a sexual chemistry so potent the director couldn't cut the scenes because the actors wouldn't stop kissing. The resolution of the triangle was swift and merciless. Elizabeth didn't just leave Eddie, she erased him. The moment she tasted the equality and fire of a relationship with Burton, the Saint versus Sinner narrative of 1958 became irrelevant. She realized she had destroyed her life for a man who was merely a placeholder. She dropped Eddie with a coldness that shocked even her closest friends. There was no guilt this time, only relief. The charade of the great love affair with Eddie Fisher was over. Exposed for the sham, it always was. Meanwhile, the wreckage of Eddie Fisher was total. In the history of Hollywood scandals, few men have lost as completely as he did. In 1957, he was America's most beloved singer, possessed a pristine reputation, and was married to the nation's sweetheart. By 1964, he had lost his wife, his children, his best friends, his recording contract, and his television show. He became a national punchline. Comedians joked that he was the only man in history to be dumped by both America's sweetheart and the world's most beautiful woman. His masculinity was publicly eviscerated. He wasn't seen as a villain anymore. He was seen as a pathetic figure, a weakling who had been chewed up and spit out by two powerhouse women. His career never recovered. The drug addiction that had fueled his bad decisions in 1958 deepened, sending him into a decades-long spiral. He spent the rest of his life writing bitter memoirs, trying to reclaim the narrative, trying to explain that he wasn't just a pawn. But history had already made its judgment. He was the collateral damage in the War of the Queens. For Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor, the resolution was different. They were scarred, yes, but they were standing. Debbie Reynolds watched the collapse of the Liz-Eddie marriage from a distance. By now she had remarried, a wealthy shoe mogul named Harry Carl, and had firmly established herself as a top box office draw in her own right. The destruction of Eddie Fisher vindicated her. It proved that the problem hadn't been her failure as a wife. The problem was that Eddie was a man who couldn't be saved. She had survived the humiliation of 1958 and emerged with her dignity intact. Elizabeth Taylor moved on to become a global phenomenon with Richard Burton. They became Liz and Dick, the most famous couple on the planet. The scandal with Eddie was relegated to a footnote in her biography. She had survived the hatred of the world and forced the public to love her again on her own terms. The ultimate resolution of the 1958 scandal was a grim irony. The two women, pitted against each other as mortal enemies, were the only ones strong enough to survive the system. The man they fought over was the only one who didn't make it out alive. The board was cleared. The game was over. But the lesson of their rivalry and their eventual secret bond was yet to be fully revealed. The true ending of this story didn't happen in a courtroom or a movie set. It happened decades later on the Atlantic Ocean. For nearly 40 years, Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds existed in separate orbits. They were polite strangers who shared a tragic history. But time has a way of clarifying things. By the late 1990s, the beauty had faded. The husbands were gone. Elizabeth had 8 marriages, Debbie had 3. And the fire of the scandal had cooled into ash. Fate put them both on the same cruise ship, the Queen Elizabeth. When Elizabeth realized Debbie was on board, she didn't hide in her cabin. She wrote a note. It was simple, lacking the drama of their youth. She asked Debbie to join her for dinner. That night, in a private dining room, the saint and the sinner finally sat down, not as archetypes, but as 2 elderly women who had survived the meat grinder of Hollywood. There were no screaming matches. There were no tears. Instead, there was laughter. Elizabeth reportedly looked at Debbie and said, "I'm sorry for what I did to you with Eddie." And Debbie, with the sharp wit that had kept her sane all those years, replied with the line that should be carved on the tombstone of this scandal. "Oh, Elizabeth, you did me a huge favor. Can you imagine if I'd been stuck with him?" They realized then what we can see clearly now. Eddie Fisher was never the prize. He was the burden. Elizabeth had inadvertently saved Debbie from a life of dealing with his addiction and insecurity. They rekindled their friendship right there, a bond forged in the fire of 1958 and tempered by 40 years of life. They even starred together in the TV movie These Old Broads in 2001, written by Debbie's daughter, Carrie Fisher. A final winking middle finger to the industry that had tried to destroy them. The symmetry of their lives continued to the very end. In December 2016, the world lost Carrie Fisher to a heart attack. The next day, Debbie Reynolds was planning her daughter's funeral when she looked at her son and said, "I want to be with Carrie." She suffered a stroke and died hours later. Elizabeth had passed away 5 years earlier in 2011. The fact that the principal players in this tragedy are all gone allows us to close the book with a clear moral verdict. The scandal of 1958 was not a story about female hatred. It was a story about female survival. Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor were pitted against each other by a studio system that viewed them as assets and a press that viewed them as sport. They were manipulated by the fragility of men and the greed of corporations. But they beat the house. They didn't let the scandal kill them. They outlived the men. They outlived the studio bosses. And in the end, they found their way back to each other. The saint and the sinner were just 2 sides of the same coin. 2 brilliant, tough women who refused to be written out of their own stories.